Hi everyone, I'm here again to do another spread-based video. In the last video I did on the Tetractys spread, based on the Pythagorean symbol of the Tetractys, I mentioned that it was very similar to the Sephiroth of the Kabbalistic system. So what I'd like to talk about today is using that symbol as the basis for a spread. If this is a symbol that you are not familiar with, or even the word Sephiroth, or Sephiroth, again, disclaimer on my Hebrew pronunciation, I am not versed in it, I sort of guess. So again, if I'm pronouncing it wrong and that offends any of you, I'm really sorry. Truly I am. I wish I could pronounce it better, and I should probably take the time to learn how. But anywho, the Sephiroth is is basically known as, in English, as the Tree of Life. You may have heard of that term instead. It basically is a diagram that describes the emanations from the one Godhead in a series of 10 emanations. Technically, when talking about God, 9 are really important, and some very traditional Kabbalists tend to see the 10th emanation as really just a byproduct of the preceding 9, that it's not even really worth talking about. But of course, many other people argue that it's very important, and we'll talk about why why it's important. So anywho, so it's essentially a system by which one can organize lots of different symbolic information. You can supposedly, in the 19th century, occultists were obsessed, and in general people were obsessed with the idea of syncretism. And syncretism is the notion that all religions, all human religions, basically dart around the same ideas. That all religion is getting at the same central theme, they just present it in different ways. Now, modern scholars of religion would have a field day dismantling that theory, and have done so. Modern scholars of religion are very much against the idea of syncretism, because I think at that point it becomes difficult to say whose standard of religion do you use in order to critique other religions, or to not critique, but to evaluate other religions and say that they're all getting at the same thing. Unless you're part of the culture that the religion takes place in, it's hard for you to evaluate it and say, well, it's the same thing as mine, or, there are many ways in which it's not necessarily the same as yours, for several, sociological reasons. But that being put aside, my point of raising syncretism is that when you read a lot of 19th century or early 20th century occult writers or esoteric writers, like I mentioned in a previous reading, I've been reading Dion Fortune's Mystical Cabal, and she and Aleister Crowley in Libra 777 talk about how the Tree of Life can be used as a filing cabinet, basically, for all these symbols of world religions, symbols and myths and all that. So that's sort of a trend of the time, and whether or not we can actually use the Sephiroth for that is sort of up to a politically correct debate. I think for all intents and purposes, for practical attempts to understand certain iconographies of at least Western concepts of religion, the Sephiroth is I keep going back and forth between Sephiroth and Sephiroth. Again, don't know. But the Sephiroth can be used for that. I mean, in general, what I think is interesting is that religion in the Eastern Hemisphere, as in basically the continents of Europe and Asia, and perhaps Northern Africa, that axis, that East-West axis, allowed for, or at least the author of Jared Diamond, the author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, would say that East-West axis allowed thoughts, ideas, agriculture, technology to move between those countries much easier. So I suppose you can pretty easily use the Sephiroth as an organizational tool for in almost any religion or philosophy from, from Ireland to Japan, more or less along that axis, especially in the mainland of Asia and the Middle East, of course, and Europe itself. But also, of course, North Africa being part of the Mediterranean. Anywho, again, these are just basically politically correct observations. But so the tree can be a very useful tool for multiple things. But what I'd like to do first is talk a little bit about the philosophy behind it. This is going to be a long video. I'm just preparing you now. But what I'm going to use for this is a visual aid. I never have visual aids. Okay. This is the Tree of Life. You may have seen it before. You may have not. I would commit it to memory as soon as possible, especially because if you are using any tarot deck made after 1910, there is a very high chance that the author of said tarot deck was basing his tarot deck on certain Kabbalistic principles and Sephirotic principles, especially if you are using Arthur Edward Waite's tarot deck or Aleister Crowley's tarot deck. If you're using any historical tarot deck like the Tarot de Marseille, as I've been using, the actual level of Kabbalah in those decks are highly debatable. But or the Visconti Sforza Tarot, if you really want to go back and use that, then Kabbalah is very, very, very limited in that, if not non-existent. So the Kabbalah was a system in some ways imposed upon tarot in the 19th century, but oddly enough, it works pretty flawlessly as an organizational system for which to explain certain qualities of certain cards or positions of the cards, as in why certain trumps have certain numbers and go in a certain order. So anywho, what I'll get, we'll talk about each emanation and the basic principles behind them. Okay. So at the very top we have what is called Ketter, which means the crown. And essentially what you're supposed to imagine are these, sorry, I'm doing this backwards, it's kind of hard. There are these three veils, basically, so-called veils of the negative, that are sort of encompassing this whole thing. And the veils of the negative represent the zero principle. There are three of them. There is the Ein, which is nothing, total nothing. Then there is the Iron Solef, which is the infinite nothingness, and that is represented by the figure 8 as opposed to the 0. The 0 basically twists itself and you get the concept of the Ein Sof. And then lastly there's the Ein Sof Or, which is the limitless light. So this is supposed to describe essentially the overarching God of the universe as far as the sum totality of the universe is concerned. Essentially, the unified consciousness of the entire universe is at best described by human language in terms of these three veils, more or less. And from these veils, essentially in the body of the infinite light, basically the Ein Sof, which is sometimes seen as the overarching logos of the universe, or the overall will of the universe, of existence itself. The Ein Sof contracts the space of nothingness, and or at least this is the philosophy behind it. It contracts it and creates this scintillating point of light. And this is what Ketter is. Ketter is known as the Ancient of Days, the Concealed One, anything that has to do with the head. It is the idea of Godhead. Because, of course, a crown, Ketter, is what you put on the head. So this is essentially the idea of, well, it's one of the main ways of conceiving God the Father, if you are thinking from the Christian perspective. But in some ways it's not good to think of it that way. Crowley calls Ketter the same thing as Iao, which is essentially the triune masculine Godhead, in which case it does make sense for it to be seen as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. However, I think it's much more productive to see God the Father as the Iron Solef business, particularly the Iron Solef, not so much the Ein or the Iron Solef or, because those are two almost feminine principles. They represent, I suppose, the anarchy or chaos that the Spirit of God moves on, to quote Genesis. So the Ein Sof is that first idea of organization, of some kind of conscious motion, okay, that has a path to go on. So Ketter is the result of that motion of nothingness, or what we can only conceive of as nothing, because God is no manifested thing. So Ketter is the first basic idea of something manifesting. It's the highest ideal, it's the highest unified aspect of a single, eventually conscious thing. It is pure consciousness in the fact that it does not distinguish much between itself and anything else. So we can, and Ketter itself is also called the first mover or the first logos. And if you use my system, I think that that represents Christ as one with the Godhead, the logos of Christ, as Pantocrator, all creator. Whereas, God is more the overarching essence of the universe, because Ketter itself is still very much connected and is almost synonymous with the Ein principle. The Ein principles veil Ketter and actually beget Ketter in a way. So again, if you're using the Christian symbolism, I hope that this kind of makes some sense to you. Okay, so now that Ketter principle divides itself into two principles and two pillars. And this, on the right pillar, is the masculine principle, essentially. And this Sephiroth, Sephiroth being singular, Sephiroth plural, this is the Zephyr of Chokhmah, and Chokhmah means wisdom, and Chokhmah is the Father. Sometimes he's referred to as Abba, the Great Father, and this is this is when it starts getting confusing when you're using the Christian symbolism and system. Because Chokhmah is also the Logos principle. Chokhmah is the will of God, but he is the will of Ketter specifically. Because the idea, I would attempt to explain it as this, the idea is that Ketter, even though it is very closely connected to the Ein principles, still is an independent being. And there is still inherent in Ketter the idea of something versus everything. It's when you get the symbol of the point in the circle, which is the same symbol as the sun in astrology. So Chokhmah represents that individual point's endless force, its endless power, its endless creative force particularly. And with that comes its willpower, its specific source of willpower. Okay. Then opposite it is the number 3, or Binah, which is known as understanding, and the Great Mother, or the Eternal Sea. She is essentially the bizarre combination of the world soul and the little soul. At least that's how I tend to see her. I think this is when it starts getting really confusing for me, but I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. The individual soul does not really have a very clear place on the Tree of Life. Some people would say that it's in the center, which we'll talk about in the number 6, but I don't really see it that way. I think the 6 is more the marriage of multiple principles and is therefore entirely androgynous, and therefore does not accurately represent the soul, which in and of itself is a vessel for containing God. It is also known as the Shekinah. Well, sort of. The Shekinah is God's presence on earth in the tabernacle, basically. And that's more along the lines of the last Sephiroth. But anywho, we'll get there eventually. So she basically is the encasement, the vessel in which that singular entity, that singular willpower, is going to basically take its shape. She is associated with form because she is the womb, basically. It's the womb in which that original idea, that original logos principle will gestate, basically. So that is, of course, very confusing, but she can be seen as the world soul, as the general, being the great sea from which all come and all must return to. She's also associated with death in that sense. The world soul is conceived of as death. But she, being also the result of the distinction between Ketter and the Ein principle, she has a uniqueness in and of herself as a vessel. But because she has this connection to the world soul, the soul of the world, that's redundant, isn't it? She is able to reach the same exalted level as that. And there is some legitimization for my explanation of this in certain tarot cards, but also the idea that Binah is dual in nature, more so than the other two, even though Chokhmah is sometimes known as the dyad, the dual principle of duality. Binah is known as sometimes Ima and Amma, and Ima is the bright, fertile mother, and Amma is the dark, sterile mother. And so there's this kind of bipolar aspect to Binah. Of course, this also goes back to the fact that basically because she is the mother of life, but she is also death. So that there's a very tenuous combination of bipolar principles in Binah. And the main thing to remember is that because she is understanding, there's kind of a lesson in that wisdom does not take any form until it is understood in the feminine. So this is why the feminine is sometimes, or the goddess Binah, is associated with the intuition, the inner ear for hearing the inner voice of God. Right, and of course also in various philosophies, the soul is the connection to God, that through the soul we come to understand or even hear the wisdom of God. And this goes, again, with Christian ideals of Mary as Queen of Heaven, the soul who is able to intercede with God, the soul who understands God, that sort of thing. But, of course, because of the fall allegory, the soul is also the root of our existence, for better or worse. So anywho, just because this is taking a very long time, this first video is going to be just all explanation, and then in the second video I'm going to talk about the actual spread. But we need to know this information before we can actually get at that spread. And I realize it's complicated, but there's so much information online about this, and please email me with questions or something, or leave a comment. The next, so these first three Sephiroth create what is called the supernal triangle, meaning they're ideal. They are beyond manifestation, they are unmanifest, and therefore they are all co-equal, and all equally an expression of God, the singular Godhead of the individual entity. Okay. So now, separating them is seen this abyss factor. And they don't have it depicted here, but basically it's that which separates the supernal triangle from all the other Sephiroth below it, okay? The remaining 7. So next we go to the number 4 here, and this is on the Pillar of Mercy, the masculine pillar. And can be, again, Pillar of Mercy is positive, essentially. The Pillar of Severity is negative. And then the middle pillar is all harmonious and is a fluid mixture of the two. Okay? And as you can see, Ketter is perfectly situated on the middle pillar, so it bears those kinds of qualities. It's totally androgynous. So 4, the number 4 is called chesed, and chesed means mercy. It has multiple names. It can also be, Gabora is power, but essentially it's the idea of kindness and charity and forgiveness. It's one of the highest human ideals, and so this is seen as basically as the highest understanding, human understanding of God that we can understand. And being the number 4, it is very similar to Binah in that it is based on form, basically. Something has definitely taken root in matter. It is not matter yet, or a substance yet, but it is ready to be there as the number 4. If you think of a building, it usually has 4 sides. The square is a very strong symbol of manifestation. Opposite it is the number 5 on the pillar of severity, and this is, as I mentioned before, Gebura. And Gebura is the idea of power and vindication of justice, essentially. So this is the other highest way we can interpret God mentally, through charity and mercy in Chesed, and as power and vengeance in Gebura. Okay. Now, mediating between the two is Tiferet. And Tiferet is the number 6, and is the harmonious blending of those two principles. Again, it's a very androgynous Sephira. Also, it receives influence, as you can see, from the Mother, the Father, and Godhead itself. And so this is the idea of the Son, S-O-N. This is the idea of the manifested Christ, the Word made flesh. This is Christ having been born of the Virgin finally. It's that idea. So it's an important Sephirah being in the center, because it really represents the initial marriage between the embodied individual, the embodied something, with its highest aspect as Godhead. So it's seen as a mediator. It's a mediating principle between the lowest and the highest, and that is very important. Tiferet itself means beauty, and that is significant too. The idea is that beauty is a combination of all these other principles. The idea of the fusion between, the perfect fusion and mediation between highest and lowest, between any opposite whatsoever, and is also a combination of force and mercy together. It's a very interesting Sephirah. Some people would call it, it's associated with the center of ego consciousness, basically the way that one basically defines themselves in their present incarnation. However, not in their present incarnation, in any incarnation, basically. It's the aspect of the manifested human that will always be. No matter what form they take, they will always have certain characteristics, certain life trajectories, and that is embodied basically in Tiferet. Okay? Okay, we're halfway done, and then I'll do the actual spread video. So after 6 comes the number 7, and this begins what is called the astral triangle. This triangle of Chesed, Gebura, and Tiferet is known as the ethical triangle, because of course it has a very ethical stint to it. But this is known as the astral triangle, or Dion Fortune even calls it the magical triangle, because she says that it's the source of magical power of the individual. And again, take that with a grain of salt. But in traditional Kabbalah, or roughly Western esoteric traditional Kabbalah, it's not seen that way. But close enough. The seventh Sephirah on the Pillar of Mercy is known as Netzach, and Netzach means victory, actually. Excuse me. Victory and triumph. And it is associated with the subjective emotions of the manifested point, the way in which that point finds its personal bliss. Okay, so it has an emotional coloration to it. Opposite it is the number 8. here on the pillar of severity again. This is the Sephirah Hod, which means splendor, H-O-D, Hod. And that is basically the point's concept of logic, and the way that point basically can use abstract thought to conceptualize things and thereby give them form. Again, form is a big aspect of the pillar of severity, whereas energy and potency is a big aspect of the pillar of mercy. Okay, then mediating between the two is the Sephirah Yesod, which means foundation. And Yesod is basically the final root in which all these influences pour down, and is basically the great equalizing machine of the universe for the individual. It's seen as basically the subconscious that basically filters through all these influences and dispenses the ones that it deems are important at a given time, basically. So Yesod is a particularly interesting Sephirah. Again, it has no real specific gender. Okay, and then lastly, the poor last Sephirah, which isn't even part of any other triangle other than the entire Tree of Life itself, is Malkut. And Malkut means kingdom. Okay, and that is basically the physical world itself, the physical manifested point, okay, in a body. And so it is associated with the animal soul, okay, the personality of the animal, or even, you know, Jung's shadow self, the whatever burdens and stress and anxieties you place upon the body gets translated into the shadow. So there, again, this is a big organizational system. Now, if it helps you to think about each Sephirah, you can think about the planets and astrological aspects of each Sephirah. Ketter has no astrological attribution at all. It is so pure and so ineffable that you cannot describe it with any term. Chokhmah is, however, all 12 signs of the zodiac. It is the entire belt of the zodiac. Okay, so that should show you how potent the power of Chokhmah is. Now, Binah is associated with the planet Saturn, interestingly enough. Okay, and then from then on, we basically follow the Platonic aspect of the Platonic system of the spheres. So after Saturn comes Jupiter for Chesed, Mars for Geburah, the Sun for Tiferet, Venus for Netzach, Mercury for Hod, Yesod for the Moon, and Malkut is the planet Earth. Okay, so that should clue you into some of the natures of each Sephirah. I know that is what basically taught me the basics. Okay, so all that being in your mind, I don't expect you to have this memorized per se, especially if this is something that you're just being exposed to now. And this was basically a very brief lesson in general Kabbalistic principles. And there is so much more that I could talk to you about and sort of have alluded to in previous videos. But I'm not going to go there for this video. So I'm going to close this video, and then I'm going to do the actual spread for you. Okay? Again, if you have any questions, leave a comment. Okay? Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.